Both at the national and federal level, Mr. Fugate has been at the forefront of disaster preparedness. Most recently, Mr. Fugate was appointed by former President Barack Obama to serve as the administrator of the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. In this role, from 2009 to 2017, Mr. Fugate oversaw the federal government's response to many severe natural disasters. Prior to this role, Mr. Fugate served as the Florida Director for the Emergency Management Division, launching the largest mutual aid response to affected states in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Fugate is the current Chief Emergency Resilience Officer of One Concern. So with that, thank you so much. We're really thrilled to have you. So just to break the ice a bit, I thought it'd be fun to discuss one of your many accomplishments so far. Someone speaking who went to school both in Miami and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. What particularly struck me was your Waffle House Index. And for those listening who might not know what this is, do you mind explaining a bit further? And if you can make the stretch, is there a connection to the civil-military coordination we're here talking about?
Absolutely. Waffle House is a restaurant in the U.S., what we call a diner. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't close. I know in parts of the country, things close on Sundays, things close in the evening. Waffle House doesn't close. They're always open, and they're mainly based in the Southeast United States. And it's very common to see them over on the highways at various intersections as you move across the region. This is also the area of the United States that sees a lot of hurricane activity. And so over time, hurricanes and Waffle House had a lot of interaction. And the Waffle House Index was an observation that in going to areas impacted by these storms, you could get a quick read on infrastructure and impacts to the community by looking at the status of the Waffle House. If they were open and had a full menu, it may not be that bad, keep going. If it's open but has a limited menu, it generally means you've had power outages. You may be under boiled water orders. They had to modify their menu to adjust to that. And you're probably looking at more what we would consider mass care impacts, people that have been impacted by the storm, but not necessarily search and rescue activities. And if you got to the area where the Waffle House was closed, that was bad. And this became an important tool because we started looking at this in 2004. Initially, the Waffle House Index was not something we were serious about. It was just an observation. But if we want to speed up response, you have to make some decisions about how much assessment do you need to do before you get to a tipping point to act. And this was critical for search and rescue and security. These are, as we talk about responding, if we're going to change outcomes, these are critical functions that you want to achieve in the first hours to first day after landfall. And if we waited for assessments, if we waited for requests for help, we would lose a day or so. And what we had learned was to mobilize resources, including the National Guard, which in the United States, when the National Guard is activated under the governor, is under state control. They're not under the president, they're under the governor. And we would work with the General of the Florida National Guard, who reports directly to the governor when we're in that situation, to activate and bring on active duty, state active duty National Guardsmen to, we call it staging, but literally getting them near the area of impact, but not in the area of impact, so we could respond quickly. And as soon as the winds would start dying down from these storms, we'd go. It didn't matter. We weren't waiting. We called it, we didn't wait for blue skies. We didn't wait for the sun to come up, because if you're injured or trapped, you can't wait for perfect conditions. And so as we would drive out of these staging areas, and it'd be National Guard, fire departments, law enforcement, highway engineers to clear debris, all moving to an area of impact, the question was always, are we there yet? It's like the kids in the back seat. Are we there yet? And you'll start seeing damage. Hurricanes are like hundreds of miles across, and you'll start seeing damages as you're driving in. And the Waffle House became a shorthand, because if they got to that interstate exit and the Waffle House was still open, they knew we're not in the hard hit area, keep going. And if they got there and the Waffle House was open but had limited menus, they knew we had problems, but they didn't require the search and rescue and the security resources that we had But if you got to the area where the Waffle House had been closed because of the storm, that was generally, you're right now on the edge of the heavy hit area. And now you wanted to start deploying your resources. And what this means is that instead of the normal 3, 4, 5 days into an event before stuff would show up, we were showing up usually about the time people started sticking their heads out, wondering what had happened and is it over yet. And that made a big difference in speeding up our response. It also had some interesting effects on getting done quicker. And again, when we use the National Guard, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is they're not full-time soldiers. They're considered part of the reserve. So their day jobs, they may be working in the community, they have jobs, they may be students. So when we bring them into state active duty, we're taking them away from their families, their communities, and their jobs to go help other folks in our state. So we also want to send them home as quickly as we can. So by getting them out early, getting things stabilized, we could then shift to other resources and capabilities and free them up to go back home, reset, and be ready for both their federal mission, which is supporting the active duty or the Defense Department in defending the country, as well as the next disaster. In 2004, that turned out to be a lot of disasters. We were hit by 4 hurricanes that year.
Thank you so much. I think the idea of the Waffle House Index, as a Southerner for the time being, was absolutely fascinating. And so hearing you talk through that and even applying it to your experience with the National Guard is absolutely fascinating and pertinent to what we're talking about here. So I know you touched a bit about that. So I'm curious now, maybe just stepping back a little bit to talk about maybe your time as a volunteer firefighter all the way to FEMA. What other experiences with civil military coordination, whether it's be to address a natural disaster or a human-made emergency, what has been your experience?
Well, when I was a local official, I knew of the role the Guard had, but I hadn't really worked directly with them. My first opportunity was when I went to the state of Florida. Initially in 1997, I became a chief of preparedness response for the Florida Division of Emergency Management. And so my relationship was, I was the lead within our agency for working with the National Guard. My counterparts of the Florida National Guard that had what we call the DISCA mission, which is Defense Support to Civilian Authorities. And our primary focus was on the disaster response and building that relationship and working with the Florida National Guard. I learned a lot of valuable lessons. The first one was too many times the civil authorities want to tell the military what they want done, and they be very specific of who they want to do it. And the National Guard says it doesn't work well that way. A better way of working with us is tell us what outcome you want to achieve, and then allow us to build the mission set around our roles and capabilities. Because although they have the primary mission and are trained for defense of the country, there's a lot of capabilities they have they can bring to disaster. Flying helicopters is flying helicopters, heavy truck and moving things, logistical support, providing security, are all skill sets that Florida National Guardsmen had. And so the thing that I think was most important was learning, don't tell them how to do the job, don't tell them who to use, but give them a mission defined by outcome, and then allow them to build that around the units they have and the mission capabilities. And in some cases, for them to give feedback, this may not be a good fit for them, or reminding us that we're taking people away from their families, their homes, their jobs, their community, and there may be another resource that's more appropriate for the mission. So it was, learning to work with the Guard, understanding how the best mission assigned them, and understanding that never forget that these are our citizen soldiers who are leaving their home. They want to serve, they're going to show up, they're not going to say no. But when we call them up, it also means their community are losing those folks. And a lot of these folks have jobs, when we bring up medical components, they're doctors and nurses in their communities. We bring up law enforcement, firefighters, A lot of people have their own businesses. So, and again, with our Florida Guard, a lot of our younger members, they're going to school, they're going to college. So it's important that we make sure that we don't, as they coached me on this, they said, look, if you think you need us, don't hesitate to call us up, because we're not, sitting in the armories ready to go. It takes us, 12 to 24 hours to get people called in, get mobilized, and be ready to go. But always send us home first. That, we're an expensive resource, but we also need to remember that we're citizen soldiers. And so we need to get them home as soon as we can.
Now, apart from the National Guard, is there any other part of the military that you involved yourself with or you have experience with?
Yeah, well, within Florida, we had all of our military installations, and they have some limited ability to respond in disasters, what they call the immediate response capabilities that a installation commander has for, like a plane crash or a fire or a tornado, where they can provide immediate life-saving assistance. But generally, that is finite in the area they can serve and what resources they can provide. My first real opportunity to work with the active duty or the standing military full time in the United States was during some of our disasters, where through FEMA, we would work with what was called a defense coordinating officer, which was a serving, in most of the cases, this came out of the Army, senior officer, usually a full colonel, who would come in and represent the military capabilities with FEMA. So if we ended up requesting resources, they would coordinate that on behalf of FEMA. The states cannot go straight to the military to ask for assistance. We go through our Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they task and coordinate that. And one of the earliest was during wildfires in 1998. We had a situation where we had a fire that was in an area that was an unimproved area, but they were having to cross a river or a small, river, or a canal to get to an area that was threatening homes. And because this is heavy equipment, big tractor plows, we didn't have it. And so we ended up tasking the military, and it turned out the Marine Corps sent down a bridging unit to Florida from Camp Lejeune to, which is up in the Carolinas. And they literally sent the bridging unit, Marine Corps, came down, set the bridge up, and allowed the people fighting this wildfire to be able to get heavy equipment into an area that was inaccessible. And so from hurricanes to floods, everything from transport aircraft to unique capabilities that the military would have, we had worked with them. And when I joined FEMA, that's really when we began, working full time with the military across a wide range of disasters. And in the United States, our military is broken up into various services. And so I think most people are familiar with the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marine Corps. Coast Guard is part of that as well as the National Guard. But during disasters, there is a command for all of the military support or defense support civilian authorities. It's called Northern Command. It's located out in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's part of, also encompasses the North American Aerospace Defense, or NORAD, which Canada is a partner of. And we would work through partnership with Northcom on coordinating and planning various missions, doing exercises, training, as well as looking at scenarios that could require a large mobilization of the military to support civilian authorities. Looking at things like catastrophic earthquakes in the central U.S. or the Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of Washington State, or major hurricanes. And so that really, I think, at that point, gave me the full spectrum of taking the lessons I learned working with the Florida National Guard. It turned out a lot of the same things that they taught me there were very applicable working with Northcom. And that was, describe the outcome you're trying to achieve versus to, identify a specific unit and say, we need you to go do this, going, here's what we need to get done. what's the resourcing capabilities. Because the other thing that we always had to keep in the back of the mind is the United States was in perpetual conflicts with the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, defense situations, and South Korea, now the South China Seas, that the military's primary mission was always the defense of the country. We would be able to use resources that weren't committed, but those were constantly changing based upon the military defense. So it wasn't like you always had the same folks you were working with, because some of those units may be deployed downrange. They rotate in and out. So that's why I think it was critical for us to really enforce this idea of describe the outcome we're trying to achieve and let our military partners look at what they have available, what's the best mission fit, and help advise that response.
Now, I'm curious, when you discuss the Northcom partnership, do you know if during the COVID-19 response, was that something that FEMA, were they partnered with Northcom the entire response period? And if maybe you can even walk us through the COVID-19 response from FEMA.
Again, I wasn't at FEMA during it, but you saw mobilization of hospital ships, which are under DOD. You saw the mobilization of the Army Corps of Engineers, which is part of the Department of Defense, helping build temporary hospital facilities. You saw where the Defense Department was supporting FEMA with medical personnel, and all this was being coordinated by Northcom. So, and the other thing is, people forget, all during COVID, hurricanes didn't stop, wildfires didn't stop, flooding didn't stop. So the military was having to manage both their defense missions, the support on COVID, as well as additional support requests in responding to some of these disasters. And so as state and local governments were finding it very challenging, at the federal level, it was also having to work very closely to prioritize where the resources were going. And fortunately, we never got to the situation that the military establishment, the Department of Defense, could not support civilian authorities. But it meant that in many cases, it was, the challenge of deploying personnel downrange when we did not have a vaccine. We were short protective equipment, yet the mission still had to be accomplished. And so that meant a lot of, the protocols, the decisions, when to go, when not to go, the testing requirements, all had to be agreed and worked out ahead of time to be able to deploy these resources.
And staying on the subject of FEMA, I'm curious do you believe, in your opinion, how smooth is the integration of the military command, like this partnership you spoke about, into the FEMA decision-making?
Well, we do what we call a prisoner swap. We had senior staff that were assigned to Colorado Springs to work with their battle staffs as they do their morning briefs and plans and exercises. And Northcom had full-time staff assigned to FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And when we would be facing a big event and we would have the video conference calls, one of the things, you'd have the Department of Defense, you'd have the National Guard Bureau, you'd have the Office of Secretary of Defense, you'd have Northcom. And so, I would travel to Colorado Springs to meet with my counterparts there. They would travel to Washington, D.C. We were on a first name basis. And that was something I learned from the National Guard is, you got to build that relationship. You gotta have trust in each other. Like any organization, we can agree to disagree, but we got to stay focused on the mission. And I think I went through, I was at FEMA for almost 8 years. I believe I had 5 different Northcom commanders that I had to work with and build, and they were all great. They were all different, but they were all great. They represented, I think I had the full spectrum of Air Force, Army, and Navy officers that served in that role. But it also gave us, as we were planning together, strengthening the team. So we weren't just 2 separate entities that only came together during disasters. we were building relationships through our training, our exercises, our joint meetings. And that gave, I think, a lot more strength. An example, when Superstorm Sandy hit the Northeast coast, General Chuck Jacoby was the commander of Northcom. And, we're on these calls and stuff, and he's calling me on the phone, and he's going, "Hey, Craig, I know you're not asking for this yet, but I've got some training dollars. I can pre-position and move some units up in the region just in case. We don't have to get a formal mission. I just want to make sure you're okay with it." And again, it was this whole idea: can we speed the process up? Can we get closer to where the need is without getting in the way? And that was just an example of, I trusted him to know that he knew what he could do and couldn't do. He wasn't just going up there to freelance or take over. But he was also trying to get better positioned, because as I think this is something that a lot of people in the public don't get, and unfortunately a lot of people in my profession don't get. The military is not set up to be as responsive as calling an emergency number and getting a fire truck. It takes time to get units moved. These are big logistical operations. And the less information you have, the less certain you have. And again, with Sandy, we weren't sure where landfall was 2 or 3 days out. We knew the region, but we didn't know exactly where it was going to hit. The fact that he was ready to start moving resources just in case went a long way to speeding up that response.
It's fascinating to hear the level of relationship building. I think from a U.S. perspective, you don't really expect to have that level of cooperation between FEMA and the military. So I was wondering, do you think could you ever see a world in which that increasing the assets available to FEMA directly would potentially replace this presence of the military in the relationships that you have now?
No, I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of countries that have historically not been interested in using their military for a variety of historical reasons. Usually this is an economic issue. There's no way that the U.S. government can afford to equip FEMA with all the capabilities that the military has every day for the defense mission. And if we're not in the middle of a war and those resources are available, why wouldn't you? And I think the key thing that other countries sometimes wrestle with is when the military deploys to a disaster in the United States, they are under civilian authority. They are not in charge. And again, this is a little bit different in a lot of countries. In our response, the president's not in charge. It is the states that are leading that response. That's the governors. And when the military is in what we call Title 10 or federal status, there are certain laws that are in the U.S. Legal framework that limits their authorities. A big one is they do not have any authority to arrest or detain people when they are deployed in a request from FEMA. If they're in their normal status, there's a law called Posse Comitatus, which limits the federal government's military role in law enforcement activities. It doesn't apply to the National Guard when they're under state active duty. And I think this is for the international audience. When you see uniformed personnel in a riot, you immediately think this is the military, and it's not. It's the state National Guard. It's the National Guard under the governor's authority. Again, they're in the Army Reserve, but when they're brought up under the governor, they are under state active duty, not under federal. They don't report to the president, they report to the governor, and they're giving the authorities in the state constitution. And so you'll see where the National Guard, in most cases, has more authorities under state active duty to support the security mission than what the active duty component would have under a federal mission. So, part of this is we had to, and this goes back to every country, is understanding the laws that govern the military in a domestic response, which is usually much different than their authorities in defending the country international. And so, we always come back to, we're a nation of laws. We have a constitution. Every military officer swears to that constitution, to obey the laws and stuff. And so I think there's this fear that, well, the military is going to always take over. And I'm like, well, that's actually a violation of the oath of office, and it's illegal. It's under civilian control.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question, which I think you started to answer in terms of maybe from either Congress or the public opinion about what are the concerns or political sensitivities about bringing the military into civilian activities.
Well, we've had tragedies in the United States going back to when I was a child. The shootings at Kent State during the Vietnam War, where National Guardsmen shot unarmed protesters. And so in parts of the country, they're very restrictive of what they use their guard for in law enforcement situations. But in general, if you think about most of what we do in disaster response is humanitarian aid, and it's logistical support, and it's not using them in a security role. But the ability to have that security role, again, in Florida, we would prefer to use our uniformed officers, law enforcement. We have a lot of ability to move folks around in state through our mutual aid. And we would use the National Guard only if we needed to augment that. In many cases, what we would do is use the National Guard to backfill, those or support them so they can perform the primary. But history and recent disasters show us that we don't always have the luxury of restricting the Guard from the security mission. We need that many more people. And again, this is less about, I think a lot of people focus on riots and things like that. When I'm talking about security and disasters, what I'm really talking about is just maintaining peace and order, providing security, providing presence. And that is something that is well within the capability of the National Guard. And in general, my observation has been when the public is dealing with disaster, seeing the National Guard is actually comforting and reminds them that we know it's bad because we sent the Guard to support them. I can remember during wildfires in 1998, then Governor Childs was out on wildfires, and a woman said, "Governor, you're not taking this serious." And the governor says, "Yes, I am. I'm here. I've got all my resources deployed." And she says, "No, sir, you don't. I don't see the National Guard. Where's the National Guard at?" And so I think in Florida, it is an expectation both of local officials and the public. It's not really bad unless the governor's calling the Guard out as a way of signaling that they're taking it serious. We try to avoid just calling the National Guard out for public relations purposes, but it is also, I think, how the public perceives them through our hurricane history and our history of other disasters, that the public actually expects the National Guard to be visible and part of that response. And it's an indicator that the governor is committing all of the state resources.
And do you find that to be true? So in the case of Florida, do you think that would apply throughout the rest of the US as well?
Well, in the last couple of years, we've seen increasing demonstrations. We've seen the National Guard called out. If you watch, they are very, it's interesting how governors have approached this. Some are very reluctant to put the National Guard on the front lines in dealing with demonstrations. They usually are using them in the background, helping with communications, helping with logistics. But we did see scenes around the nation's capital where you had, protesters and military units clashing. And so I think there's always, from the policy perspective, this is within the mission space of the military, but we have to be very careful, because if the public now sees the military as a threat or something that's not desirable to have responding to domestic events, we lose a lot of capability. And we've seen this in some countries that have very strong reservations about using the military in a domestic event because of past histories and worries about the military becoming engaged or involved in internal issues, which unfortunately takes a lot of resources away from that response.
Thank you so much. And I think it's interesting. Now we're talking about the US domestically. And I'm curious now to maybe broaden this a bit to internationally as well, especially when the issues and threats we're talking about, for example, climate change or pandemics. There are no borders in this sense. So I'm curious, with your career at FEMA, did you ever work in disasters abroad or overseas? And if so, did you work with militaries overseas as well?
Not really. In the United States, the Division of Labor is FEMA is the primary domestic coordination for the president for disasters. And then USAID, the International Agency for International Development, or US Agency for International Development, is the primary for coordinating international disaster response. But I worked, FEMA ended up supporting the Haiti response after the earthquake that occurred there, worked very closely with Southern Command and military units that were engaged down there. We had a lot of FEMA resources deployed, kind of unusual for us. Most of my work at FEMA was actually through work with NATO through the Civil Emergency Preparedness Committee. It's a legacy of the Cold War, but the U.S. ambassador to NATO, their representative on that committee is the FEMA administrator. So I had a lot of opportunities to work with my counterparts. And it was interesting, particularly for the EU, is NATO membership and the NATO Civil Emergency Protection Committee, and then the European Union and ECHO, which coordinated humanitarian and crisis response, both the international aid as well as domestic, that it wasn't unusual for me to
Here's something I found on the web.
meet with both of them.
Wikipedia.org.
Excuse me.
When a humanitarian crisis occurs, the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, strives to efficiently mobilize and coordinate aid. Did that answer your question?
I've never had my smart speaker answer a question in the middle of an interview, so sorry about that. But it was interesting that in working with different countries, I would be working with the military representatives for a country of NATO, and then I would meet their counterparts over at ECHO, and they go, "So what did the military talk about?" And that happened more than once, and I began to understand that we were probably more fortunate that we had built a better relationship and had daily, interactions with our military counterparts and had clear defined roles and responsibilities. But it was something that was interesting was between the EU, ECHO, and NATO deconflicting the mission space. And there was a lot of, I'd ask questions, and there's not that many countries that have an equivalent to the National Guard, where you give the local jurisdictions authority over military reserve units. Part of this goes back to governing structures. There's not that many federal governments in the world where we delegate down to states a lot of the authority to respond to disasters. Germany is one, Australia is another country, but England, Britain is a national government. In fact, a lot of their response organizations are nationalized, police, fire, things like that. So it was one I always came back to when people start talking about military support. I'm like, well, first thing you got to start with is, what is the constitutional foundation of the nation, and what is the role of the military, and what are the prohibitions or allowances for them and authorities they would have in a domestic response that was not an act of war. In various countries it's different. And so while NATO was primarily focused on the defense of their area, less about domestic response, the EU had both of those missions, and yet you had conflicting, I think, philosophies of what that role could be. And NATO increasingly recognizing that crisis created because of natural hazards that impact a country, that it didn't matter whether it was a disaster or terrorist attack or an asymmetric war, but if a government became destabilized and the public began to lose confidence in that government, it would give adversaries an opening to potentially escalate to a point where this could result in what they call Article 5 at NATO, which is the self-defense. Any attack on any country is an attack on all of NATO, and they come to their aid. And NATO became increasingly concerned that if countries could not manage internal crisis, that could escalate and now provoke a potential conflict. And so you started seeing NATO really starting to look at domestic crisis management as an area of concern, and talking about things like building resiliency, building capacity to manage crisis so that a country was more resilient and less vulnerable to destabilizations. ECHO had a very different approach, but was very similar in the response. And I think there was also a history of not having really bad disasters throughout a lot of Europe. I mean, when I was there was a lot of discussion about it was the southern tier countries with the droughts and the wildfires and the earthquakes. But with climate change, we're seeing increasing heat waves. We're seeing record-setting floods. One of the enhanced partners of NATO, Sweden, is now seeing fires in the Arctic Circle. I mean, Sweden was always what we call a donor country. They sent help to everybody. They didn't need help. They didn't have disasters that big. And yet they were finding wildfires of a scale that they were having to request mutual aid. And so you have ECHO's mutual aid requirements of being members of the EU to come to each other's assistance. You have NATO's defense pieces, a lot of overlap there. But I always start with those are overarching organizations. You have to come back to the specific country and go, what is their constitutional framework? And both the limitations of authorities they give the military for domestically, and in some cases, it's also the historical context of the military and the preference not to engage them in domestic because of prior history.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think you touched upon the point about NATO and ECHO and then the Cold War legacy. So I'm curious, in your opinion, if we're looking ahead in the future and we have militaries working cross borders to address humanitarian or natural disasters, do you think there is the threat of military diplomacy?
Well, the U.S. has looked at disaster response as part of the mission of the military in international crisis. It is seen as one of the ways that we can increase friendly relationships. Even with nations we may not have great relations, we will always offer assistance in disasters. And that ability to quickly get in areas and be more than, what I would call, it's less about active diplomacy as helping your neighbors and helping other people helps build goodwill and reduces the threat of conflict, or at least puts faces on there. And there's some countries, quite honestly, that the idea of the U.S. military supporting them in a disaster is unacceptable to them, but they'll allow the non-military resources into that country. But as we see increasing frequency of climate-driven disasters that are rapidly exceeding our systems that were built to deal with disasters. I like to tell people the climate has changed. We haven't. Even within the EU, the response mechanisms were created for a much more stable weather pattern. And now they're seeing disasters at a frequency and scale that they're having to adjust. And I think that's where we're going to have to really go back to. We can't afford to build all the resources we will need to respond. The military is a resource. We have, in some cases, history to overcome. In some countries, we have laws to overcome. But I think ultimately, we're going to have to figure out how to engage the military as part of the team, not as standalone and not necessarily they're in charge, but take their capabilities and resources and add that to the toolkit in responding to disasters. And, in the U.S., I think we've done a good job of doing that. We have built those relationships. We do have our bumps in the road, and particularly when it comes to civil disturbances. But, I think when you look at all the resources they can bring to bear, from COVID to hurricanes to earthquakes to, wildfires, not having the military means the taxpayer would have the burden of providing a lot more resources that would be rarely used for disasters that just wouldn't be sustainable in anybody's budget, or build a relationship with the military that has a lot of those capabilities that are funded for the primary mission of defending the country, but have the secondary use of domestic support that most of the agencies that deal with disasters would never see that kind of or level of funding to build those resources.
Right, and I think as you're talking, you realize just how much of a cutting edge issue this is, and how I think this is going to be the topic in the next 10 years of how do you address all of these boundless issues and threats with different militaries and the cultural context as well. So I think getting a bit into the nitty gritty here, I'd love just to hear More of your opinions in terms of, do you personally think the use of military assets should be more normalized and streamlined into disaster management?
Yes. Those countries that have had a lot of disaster activity have done that because it was a necessity. Some countries have had the luxury of not having big disasters and not having to integrate them. And the last thing you want to do is to do that after the first big disaster. And as we see the frequency and tempo, and again, I have to reinforce this, the climate's already changed. I don't care what we do to reduce greenhouse gases. The weather-driven phenomenon that basically oscillate between extreme rainfall events that are record-setting almost every year, in some cases every month, extreme heat, drought, now water scarcity. This, the things that NATO and the EU have been very concerned about is increased pressure on migration. Where previously that was really driven by conflict. What happens when it starts being driven by water scarcity or food shortages? Internationally, we've seen that food prices are rising. We're seeing supply chain issues, a whole lot of things going on, and that's already happened. Yet we haven't really grown our resources and capabilities to respond to disaster. So for governments that are now challenged with having increased frequency of disaster activity, where do you go? Mutual aid will buy some assistance, but in many cases, it's the military that is sometimes an untapped resource. And I think if we go with these tenets, that if we use the military under civilian authority, not putting a military officer in charge of something, but keeping it under civilian authority, if we focus on the humanitarian response needs of taking care of people, keeping them safe, providing logistical support, a lot of the capabilities the military has. And we understand that the military is not the answer to every problem and should be judiciously applied, but it needs to be part of that capability, because if we don't do that, and the disasters are increasing at the rate they're going, there's going to be those disasters where there's nothing left. And the only thing left is the military. And if we haven't built the relationship, we haven't established ground rules, we don't have the legislative authority, then we really start getting into a gray area. And that is what happens when government fails their citizens in their time of need, and they begin to lose confidence in that government, and how legitimate are they going to be in the eyes of the public during that crisis. We saw a little bit of that during Hurricane Katrina. So it's a threat even to the United States, that our failures in disasters, it's not that things don't go wrong. I think people get that. But when they lose confidence that the government isn't doing everything possible, and leaving the military idle could be that, tipping point where the public begins to lose confidence in their elected leadership for their failures to bring all the resources to bear.
And I'm curious now, with your work with One Concern, are you starting to broach this issue, or are you already working on this issue with your present work?
Well, my work with One Concern is really about trying to model impacts from natural hazards to ask the question, well, how bad could it be? Instead of looking at historical context and trying to model impacts that we can then plan against. I still do a lot of work in the policy space. I've been working on a lot of different issues. And so, One Concern, we're trying to use, how do you use machine learning and artificial intelligence to do a better job of modeling impacts of things that have never happened, but are increasing in frequency and likelihood of happening in the natural hazard space. My other work is as disasters are getting bigger, when are we going to do something different? And that's what I try to get across is climate has changed. Our coping mechanisms, our systems. You think about the international response, which is basically a humanitarian aid model, and how that doesn't work for Japan, doesn't work for Australia, doesn't work for France, doesn't work for Germany. Yet we built a lot of our international capability around humanitarian aid. Now we're seeing more and more needs for mutual aid, that previous countries who never thought they would be asking for help are now getting hit so many times and so hard that they're at the point where, yes, we will need help from outside. And no, this won't be a humanitarian aid model, which is a slower model. It's focus is much different. And in these types of events, we're looking at how can we move faster. And that is where we usually see the first conversations with the military, because it's easy, it's not as threatening. It's just things like military transport of flying resources into areas, providing logistical support, loading and unloading trucks, and moving supplies around. And for some countries that have not yet looked at how the military would engage in domestic response, that may be the easiest thing to do, is the logistical support, because it's the least threatening and it's the least likely to have uniforms on the street where the public is concerned about the military in a law enforcement role. They're more in the background helping supply chain. And we're seeing now, because of supply chain issues secondary to COVID and the global disruptions, that some countries are turning to their military to provide resources just to help unplug things. I mean, look at what England was having to do looking at fuel shortages and the lack of lorry drivers. So, you know, it isn't always going to be the big flood or the earthquake that causes the military support. Increasingly, we're seeing their logistical capabilities being called upon. And what our situation, probably not what we traditionally think of a disaster, but look at what's happened across Europe. Look at what happened in other countries where they are looking at the military to plug gaps in the logistical roles that they're having to fill.
That is so well said. And just to conclude finally, I think, in your opinion, whether it be talking with a small think tank based in Brussels, or maybe you're presenting to Congress, what do you really think needs to be done to actually make civil military coordination work moving ahead?
Well, what I've found to get people, because they always come up with reasons why not to, is you have to have a forcing mechanism to get people out of what they want to do and what needs to be done. And I think that's the challenge, is how do you get people to understand that doing what you've been doing won't work, as we see an increased frequency and scale of natural hazards and their impacts, and that you got to do something differently. Because I can talk about the military and how it can be effectively used and how to integrate it, and how to put the safeguards in place and how to address the concerns. But if the planners are saying, well, it's never going to get that bad, or we always have another way of doing it before we call the military, they never get to that point until they have to, and then it's not going to be good. So I think you have to really focus on scenarios that can happen. They may not have happened. They may not even be likely. We call this, looking at high consequence, low probability. But basically give them the scenario that without the military, they're going to fail, and address it that way. Because I've seen this, I call it one of my deadly sins of emergency management. I've seen too many people in my profession always try to make the disaster fit the plan, instead of recognizing that plans have to be adaptive and flexible to the disaster, and systems don't always scale up very well. They have in the US. And if I'm running out of resources, who's left? And if I'm not engaging the military in that, that's who's left. And I don't want to find that out or plan for that after the disaster has happened. I need to build that relationship and engage and establish the ground rules, so that we can effectively engage the military, address the concerns that people may have about the military's role in a domestic response, and clearly establish, if needed, legal authorities to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Fugate. On behalf of all of us, it's been such an honor to speak with you.